Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and this is another video in response to a question from a Patreon supporter. And Daniel B. asked about the Sørup runestone from the island of Fyn in Denmark, and specifically about an argument that has been made by Stig Eliasson that this is in the Basque language. Now, I am not proficient in Basque. I have only studied it from an external perspective, but I know a Basque scholar, and I have asked her to review the language internal evidence, which I'll talk about a little bit and largely kind of let her speak for herself there. That's Professor Juliet Blevins. Um, but I also want to look at some of the kind of language external arguments that Eliasson makes in the two articles about this that I've read by him and address what I think is um, not a crazy argument, but also not a correct one. So to begin with, I am an Old Norse specialist, and my background is in Indo-European historical linguistics more broadly. So I can handle evidence from any Indo-European language. It's all, um, I may not be a fluent speaker of all of them or something like that, but I can certainly figure out the grammatical structure of all of them. Basque is a different animal, and it might ultimately be related to Indo-European languages. So actually, Juliet Blevins was on the channel, um, I guess a couple of years ago now, talking to me and my friends and colleagues, Professor Tony Yates at UCLA and Dr. Luke Gordon at the University of New Mexico, about her theory that there is a distant relationship between Basque and the Indo-European languages, which we take very seriously, although it hasn't won widespread approval. Now, Juliet Blevins at the City University of New York is the only person I know who has competence in Basque, and so the only one who I could ask for an evaluation of Eliasson's reading of the text of this stone as Basque. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but let me first talk about these articles, and part of the reason why I'm doing this indoors is that I've got to show you a bunch of the stuff, and often the only visuals that I can even show you are from his articles. And his articles are a little bit hard to track down. So thank you to another friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Kelsey Fuller Schaefer, for getting these articles for me. If there are two things that I miss from having a job at a university the most, they are health insurance because the emergency room is really expensive now, and being able to get articles from anywhere for free. So we've got two articles. Let me show you what they are. Let me just bring these both up here. So there is this one called The Letters Make No Sense at All, Språklig struktur i en obegriplig dansk runinskrift. So linguistic structure in a unintelligible Danish runic inscription. This is the earlier article. I want to say this is 2006 or 2007, also a little bit shorter. And then there is a longer article from 2010, I believe, which is called, am I showing you the right one now? I think I am. Chance resemblances or true correspondences on identifying the language of an unintelligible Scandinavian runic inscription. Now, this later article, which is in English, gets a little bit more in depth about his analysis, but the earlier article does do one really interesting thing that the later one doesn't, which is he goes through some alternative possible readings in some other neighboring languages. For example, he considers in a little more detail in that earlier article a reading of the text as potentially being in Old East Slavic, right? Ancestral language to today's Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, etc. Not a plausible reading, but he kind of does this devil's advocate reading of the text in multiple different languages before presenting his Basque interpretation. And he does a little bit more of that in the earlier article. He does do it in the later article too, and in the later article, he also presents a reading in Latin, which is not his own, but actually comes from an article from, I believe it was 1925. Where is that? It's by Orloff. And in fact, you know, as tough as this inscription is to read, I don't think that this Latin interpretation is madness. It's, as plausible as any other reading here. And the reading of this sequence here as Thorlok, which is a common Norse name, is at least probably the most plausible reading of that particular sequence. Um, I didn't actually find that Latin interpretation nuts. Like you can't prove a reading of this inscription. It's too weird. Let me show you a picture, and again here I'm going to be relying on his articles for this stuff. Um, so it's a huge stone. I haven't been in its presence physically, but this is 7 or 8 feet tall. So you're talking about something that was meant to catch attention, and it looks damaged, right? This isn't the complete thing, so it was probably even taller than this once. Um, this has a completely, as the titles of his articles would imply to you, on the surface, unintelligible inscription. So it's always hard to kind of read through in a photograph. I mean, I would rather look at a photograph than look at somebody's transcription. Um, that being said, look at my transcription because I looked at a photograph and made this for you. And it's at least based on a photograph, not on somebody else's transcription. Secondhand transcriptions are going to be much worse than firsthand transcriptions. I wish I had seen it in person, but I haven't. I don't live particularly close to Copenhagen where this is kept. Okay, so this is what I see looking at the photograph. Um, so if I were just reading this, sort of naively to you, what would I say this says? I would say this says me, Cerness, and then we've got an S with something under it. So maybe not an S, but Cernessen, or my first thought about this jumble together is that looks like a bind rune that's meant to be auk, awk, the word and, even though the diagonal bar is flipped, so it looks like an N. This particular bind rune or ligature is not elsewhere attested, but it wouldn't surprise me if you made a bind rune of that very common word that would look like that. Then B, what looks like a damaged H. We've got some stuff missing. We've got some damaged letters, but there looks like another ligature that's an SA together. Then down here, it looks like we've got, let's see if I can type a little bigger, SR thorn, right? The th sound, me, word divider, IT, something missing probably, SIHLI, word divider, LI. And then over here, the final line, it looks like we've got Isifu, Thulak, Isera, and then word divider, and then Li. This does not look like Old Norse. I mean, that word alk could be Old Norse. If Orloff's reading from the 1920s is right, This could be the name Thorlock. By the way, what I read as a U here was apparently also read as a U by Orloff, but Eliasson, and it seems like more recent commenters read it as an R. You'd be surprised how often R and U are actually difficult to tell apart in runes. My basic test is the bottom of this side stroke getting further away or closer to the vertical stave. If it's getting closer, I tend to say, okay, that's an R. If it's getting further away, I tend to say that's a U, but it's not a perfect test, especially with younger Freelark from the Viking Age like this. So could be an R or a U. I kind of like a U better. I'm not committed to it. Could be an R. And obviously, with so many damaged runes or partial runes, multiple of these could be something different than what they look like to me on the surface or look to somebody else like on the surface. But I think it is pretty clear that this is not just a straightforwardly meaning Old Norse text, even if it has Old Norse words in it. For one thing, you've got these sequences of consonants like the surthm, uh, that are just impossible in Old Norse, or the cern up here, or the sn. Um, you can't do anything with that in Old Norse. I'm also a little bit suspicious about the fact that the only place that this rune comes up is apparently, if we can trust these dots and X's as word dividers, this looks like it's the second to last letter in a word. This is much more common in the last letter of a word. Not an impossibility in the second to last letter of the word if this is an adjectival form, but what adjective would this be? Um, Date of this text, I mean, we're looking at younger Futhark, so it's Viking Age or later already. Um, the use of a dotted I to mean E, if that's what it means here. But at any rate, the use of a dotted I at all points to the very end of the 900s or later. Um, Ornamentation on this looks, I mean, if you didn't look at the reading of it, but just sort of looked at the physical stone, uh, I think you would say, oh, this is a stone from maybe the early 1000s from Sweden. And others have commented about the fact that it looks like sort of Swedish ornamentation as well, even though it's firmly Danish find site. So that's kind of an interesting side note. Okay, so Eliasson looks at this and says, you've got these sequences that don't make sense in Old Norse. And he says, and he dismisses the Latin interpretation, and he says, I can't make it make sense with, um, Old East Slavic. Okay, fair enough. I can't make it make sense in any of these languages either. He then proceeds to say that it does make sense in Basque if you supply a lot of vowels that aren't there in this text. Now, right on the surface, right at the top, I read this and I say, if you're going to start supplying vowels here, why not supply vowels that get you Old Norse words, right? For example, we've got this sequence SN here. Why not, make that sun, right? An extremely common word that you would see in an Old Norse inscription. I don't think you can carry this very far because there's a lot of places where, I mean, like, if you held a knife to my throat, I could probably make up Old Norse words to fill in the blanks, uh, and where there are no vowels in these consonant sequences for all of them, but I probably couldn't make anything that looked particularly reasonable. I think that Eliasson is to be commended for taking this and trying to make something readable and sensible out of it that uh, is not wild in its content, right? The inscription that he winds up, the text that he winds up reading out of this inscription in Basque is exactly the sort of message that you read all the time in runic inscriptions. It's so and so raised this, had these runes carved for so and so. That's great. The very everydayness of it is a commendable point in favor of his interpretation. The problem, I think, is just the method of getting there and the fact that apparently the Basque interpretation does not hold water in terms of the history of the Basque language. So let's take a look at that. While I'm talking about this, folks, you know that I've got to tell you, um, it's time for your Yuletide shopping. And if you want to support this channel, and I hope that you do, because I make lots and lots and lots of videos for you folks for free, talking about stuff about Old Norse language, runes, Norse mythology, etc. I hope very much that you will visit my friends at Grimfrost. It does support the channel. They do have a great offer where they cover all USA tariffs and import costs. And they have a daily offer today. They're offering a scarf for a special discount, and they also offer my books. So check them out if you haven't already and tell them that you came from here. All right, let's look at Stig Eliasson's interpretation in Basque. And by the way, his interpretation in Basque, I must say, is more responsible than the interpretation that you sometimes find online with people talking about this interpretation. Um, I have found a lot of folks talking about this online, acting like what they've got is a much wordier uh, text than what he actually proposes. His interpretation is, it matches the length of this inscription at least, right? Um, okay, so fundamentally, how he winds up reading this, and again, I can't interpret the Basque for you, but it's the would be translated as name, let, carve. We're assuming there's a word missing there. These runes for her husband, name, surname, um, name, something missing that would wind up being had carved for his her uh like aunt, uh for Isabah, if Isabah is a name instead of aunt. Okay, now you might notice there's a lot of words that are still missing here, that we're kind of assuming are there. But his reading depends pretty heavily on a fairly daring reading of where is it? This, which really in the inscription is just Orn, right? Yeah, and that's also, by the way, coming out of this in UK is coming out of that bind rune of three runes that I said looked to me like it might be Auk rather than Nuke. Also, by the way, with bind runes ligatures, it could be hard to tell what sequence to read it in because the sequence could actually be UNK or UAK or even KUA or something. They can be pretty inconsistent about this. But a big part of his interpretation relies on the fact that apparently Basque loanwords, but Basque doesn't start words with R, as I understand it. So loanwords into Basque from languages where those words start with R would receive a new epenthetic vowel at the start of the word, right? So he's seeing urn, right? This vowel isn't actually written in the inscription, as it's got the vowel before the R because Basque needs a vowel before an R, and then it's leaving out the actual vowel that you would write between R and N, right? He's seeing urun as the borrowing into Basque from the Old Norse word rune. Now, just that is a lot of assuming. You know, to me, if you want to read urn as rune, that's not an impossible reading just because they can be really bad at sequencing letters and spelling, right? I mean, that just looks to me like if you're going to read that as rune, you kind of can. You just have to say, well, this is a speller who wrote the vowel before he wrote the consonant. That kind of metathesis in spelling is not uncommon, and it's especially common with R's. So I don't know that I would read rune there, but I don't think that's an impossible reading. I'm just a little suspicious of how many steps it takes to get to this is a Basque hearing of the word rune that, by the way, doesn't write the other vowel in the word that you would expect to hear. Um, He also sees a Basque word for uh, husband here. I'm a little skeptical of this, as I'm skeptical of so many things. For one thing, we've got to supply a whole consonant that is not actually visibly there. Um, I just, and by the way, Juliet, in reading this, thought that there should be an H there, probably two. I'm just not very confident about this. I think that the main thing that makes this interesting is the observation that you have two sections of this stone that end in Lee. So that could be meaningful. That could mean something. That's not a derivational or inflectional morpheme in Old Norse. Um, as Juliet points out, it could be actually in an Old Slavic language, although I don't see much evidence to think that this inscription is in Slavic any more than it is in Old Norse or Basque. Um, hard to think of a word that would add up to being from in Old Norse either, the root of a word. But I think the most interesting thing that he does, and I'll show you the version of this from the other article, is he sees these constructions as harmonizing with Basque grammar. Um, the difficulty is that not all of his conclusions about what Basque would have looked like at this time appear to be historically sound. For example, this M starting this morpheme up here. I mean, if this is even the first letter of this word, this we don't know. Uh, right. I mean, like actually one huge problem with this is that a very possible interpretation of the stone is even if this text is complete, are we reading the letters that we're supposed to be reading here? Because coded runes, cryptic runes, are actually pretty common, where you substitute one letter for another letter in the way that you would in one of those newspaper cryptogram type puzzles. Um, or you have a code for where the letter is positioned in the alphabet, in the Futhark alphabet. So you basically kind of do like a number puzzle to figure out what letter is meant. You see this all the time on Viking Age and medieval inscriptions. In fact, the Rook runestone, the longest runic text in stone, which I did a video with Professor Henrik Willems actually on site about that stone, where he read the entire thing for us. It was a wonderful video, thanks to him. Um, the Rook runestone is full of codes like that, where you have to substitute one letter for another, but it's systematic, right? You substitute the next letter in the Futhark order, or you substitute the one, the opposite one from this row if you break it up into three rows. There are systems, and none of those common systems where you substitute, the next letter or the letter after or a letter in a different row, uh, make a meaningful message here in Old Norse. Um, it's really, really interesting that Eliasson points out that if you use a random number generator, I think that's in this. Yeah, if you use a random number generator to just generate sequences, you're going to generate way more sequences of consonants uninterrupted by vowels than you see on this inscription. Interesting observation, right? I mean, that suggests that these clusters are not um, fake or random or accidental, that there is some kind of plan behind this inscription, and that it's not just some kind of fake um, attempt to make a stone for somebody who doesn't know how to read, or perhaps an attempt to make a stone by somebody who doesn't know how to read, right? We do see imitations in runic inscriptions of runic, or I should say pseudo-runic inscriptions of runic text by people who don't seem to be literate and are copying something from another inscription so the letters don't look quite right or they're in the wrong sequence or something like that. Even then, you can often tell what word was meant to be written. For example, there's an inscription, I can tell you about it. I think I have a picture of this from my um, rune class that I did in September, October. By the way, folks, I'm doing a another rune class in January, February, although that's called Reading and Writing Runes. It's more for people who are interested in um, using runes for artistic or creative purposes. I'm not going to be able to track this down live while I'm talking to you, but there's an inscription that has M's where you would expect E's, and those two letters look really similar in Elder Futhark. So that looks like somebody who's got a, a source text that they're copying, but they're confused enough about the alphabet that they don't copy the right letters. Just like somebody who's learning the Roman alphabet might see a text that's got one or two letters look kind of like E's and F's. That's got some F's and turns them into E's because they don't actually understand the distinction between those letters. They just know that they're both letters in the alphabet. Um, the possibility is certainly there. I don't think it can be dismissed entirely that that's what's happened with the Sørup runestone, that somebody had an example text and copied it wrongly. Um, at the same time, counter arguments to that are then where are at least some recognizable words? I mean, the closest thing, again, seems to be, maybe the word and, if you read that one ligature as having an A, maybe the name Thorlock, which you also have to read a particular rune as a U, that might be an R. Um, and maybe uh, if that's not Thorlock, you could see um, down here, you could maybe see an attempt to write Futhark, not very well, but maybe, right? Or I mean, if we're just really, really digging, you could see the word is there, S in Viking Age Old Norse. But speaking of newspaper puzzles, if you've got one of those puzzles where it's a word search and you're trying to circle the words vertically and horizontally and diagonally that are in a big cloud of letters, you're a lot more confident that you're seeing a word that somebody intends to be there if it's longer, right? So if I find concise in one of those word clouds, I'm a lot more confident that's one of the words that the designer of the puzzle intended me to see than I am if I see, rut, right? Um, Same way, when you're not sure what a text says in an ancient or medieval language, the words that are recognizable from long strings of letters are going to be more plausible indications of what you're looking at than short ones. So I think that actually the Thorlock, if that's it, if that is what's there, is your best indication that this is meant to be Old Norse and is maybe just really mistakenly boneheadedly carved. Now, Eliasson objects to this explanation and says, this stone looks too good. It's too obvious, right? It's a big monument. Somebody with money and resources commissioned this. Why would they not commission someone who knew how to write? And that's a fair enough objection. But, anyone alive in 2025 knows that you can log into x.com and see people with plenty of money writing things that are ostensibly in spoken modern languages that make no sense to readers thereof. Um, Joking aside, um, it's not that crazy in a context where people are illiterate to say, I want something that looks cool, um, and not really care what it says because you can't read it. To a certain extent, people do this anyway with languages and alphabets that they're not familiar with. I mean, how often does someone add, kanji to the outside of a restaurant or gift shop or to their internet handle or something like that, not being able to read it, but just thinking that it looks rad. People do this with runes today. They do it with um, hieroglyphs, right? I don't think that that's an impossible explanation, and I think that actually it's probably the most compelling explanation for this stone. Again, I don't think Eliasson is crazy to go off on this limb and say, hey, maybe this is written in Basque. Why not check that out, right? I mean, crazier things have been true. So I don't want to fault him for going out on a limb about that. I think people, need to think outside of the box, but we also need to test those things. We need to subject them to other people's scrutiny. which he has. He's published this idea, and I'm saying, I don't agree with it, but I respect having an idea that's so out of the box and submitting it to the world, uh, even if I don't think that it's right. Now, Juliet, um, of course, as I said, actually knows Basque and read this over and has multiple objections to the use of Basque here. She said I could just, share this email. I'll share all this stuff on Patreon for folks who want to see this in detail. But there are apparently quite a few places where we have implausible sequences and words that don't work with Basque or don't work with Basque at this stage of the language. Again, I am not familiar enough with Basque to evaluate that, but I'm very thankful to Juliet for taking the time. And again, I'll share her remarks in full for folks who want to read them on Patreon and maybe even get Juliet to come back on the channel to talk about this inscription or other interesting questions about Basque. By the way, um, if Basque seems really, really random as a language to come up in Denmark, around 1,000 years ago, yeah, it's not the most obvious language to come up there. I mean, the first one you would think of would be Old Norse, Old Danish. The second most likely might be, Low German. The third most likely, or maybe second most likely, would be Latin because that's the language of the church. Um, But Basque is not ludicrous. Eliasson does point to archaeological um, and literary records of contacts between Vikings and the Iberian Peninsula, um, centuries before this and centuries after. Um, we're talking about seafaring people, both in Scandinavia and in the Iberian Peninsula. So they do occasionally contact one another. In fact, centuries later, there would be an Icelandic Basque pigeon that would develop from contacts between Icelandic and Basque seafarers. So it's not utterly ludicrous. And I think when he was looking at the possible connection with the Old East Slavic, I checked because I thought to myself, like, is Novgorod or Bilbao closer to Finn in Denmark, right? And it was actually pretty close. I don't think one was like noticeably, at least as the crow flies, closer. I think maybe Novgorod was a hair closer as the crow flies, but it's not the most ludicrous thing in the world. Um, so I hope it doesn't sound like I've been making fun of Eliasson's argument. Again, I respect stepping outside of the box, submitting an idea like this to scrutiny. This is the only way scholarship moves forward, is coming up with ideas and testing them. But I don't think he's right. I think that probably what we are looking at is um, someone very poorly copying a text written by someone else that had meaning in a different context than Old Norse, and just doesn't have meaning in the context in which we're seeing it. It's a monument with mistakes, which is not the most impossible thing in the world. Every runic inscription probably has some mistake in it. Um, it's not like people were writing so often, probably that they had Merriam-Webster levels of consistency in their spelling and such. The other possibility that I think is a distant second is that it's some kind of code that nobody's cracked. And if it is, it's a tough, tough code that I don't think we see in any other inscription. Um, Another very distant third possibility is that, there's a bunch of acronyms here or something, but that doesn't seem super likely to me. It is true that in a lot of epigraphic traditions, there's a lot of abbreviations, like Romans are addicted to abbreviations, right? You get now and then you get this sort of stuff in runes, but they're nothing like as addicted to abbreviations as like Romans. Um, and I, you always have to wonder when you're looking at lots of abbreviations, who was meant to read this, right? You have to have not just a writer, but also an audience, readership that understands the abbreviations that you're using. If you don't, what's the freaking point of using them? The only reason that you can use etc. in English is that people know what that stands for. You have to have a body of people who are used to and ready to receive these. And actually, I think that's a huge hole with the Basque argument too, right? How many people speaking Basque would read runes and would be ready to supply all the vowels that are being left out of this runic inscription, right? I mean, if you're gonna carve something in runes in Basque, why not do it in a way that's boneheadedly clear, uh, or as much as you can with a really inefficient alphabet like Younger Frühlark. I also wondered to myself if this were an inscription, or the equivalent inscription with the equivalent letters found on a stone, say near Bilbao, right, in Basque country in the Pyrenees, would this be acceptable as a Basque inscription? Would people look at this if it were in the Roman alphabet and say, "Oh yeah, that's Basque"? Juliet's analysis suggests that probably not. And I think that that's also pretty fatal for the Basque argument. So, long story short, I don't think it's Basque, um, but I don't have an alternative answer to you for what this stone might say if it really says anything. But thanks so much, Daniel, for posing the question. And thanks, Patreon, for supporting me. Thanks to those out there getting books during this holiday season, or perhaps getting a nice Wanderer's Journal to write their notes in. And till next time, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you and yours all the best.